Well, here we are in John chapter 18. This one is, again, slowing things down. We're getting this idea of uh, instead of a chapter possibly taking a couple of days to a week or so, this chapter is going to come down to one night, basically. So this is Jesus is betrayed in this chapter. We're going to learn more about this. So, verse 1, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kedron, where was a garden, into the which he entered, and his disciples. So this is after the Last Supper. He's done his those final sermons that we've gone over the last several chapters. He's got all that done. Now they're heading over to, this is the Kidron Valley. Okay, this is a wadi, and a wadi is a washout area. So it's where a river runs through it. It's where, like, when you have your major floods, it runs through this valley. So it's this wadi that's basically a cemetery. There's a lot of people that have been buried in this area as well. So he went over to this orchard. Okay, this is a vineyard of olives, grove of olive trees. Basically, this is usually in these places that there would be in these gardens, basically in these areas, you'd have a press. So you're either pressing grapes for a wine press, you're pressing olives with an olive press. So either way, it's this press, this squeezing, putting intense pressure on something to get the juice out of it, basically. This is Gethsemane. So this is where he's at. Verse 2, and Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oft times resorted thither with his disciples. So he knew where they would be, because this was the habit Christ had of taking his apostles to this place. This wasn't just suddenly he's going here. So here's what's interesting is we sometimes hear of Christ coming over to this side of the valley. He's sometimes we've seen this a little bit, but maybe he went more often than we think to this Garden of Gethsemane, and maybe he knew it, like, okay, this is where it's all going to go down. Okay, whew. All right, one day it's coming. And that he probably gave some extra teachings and things to his apostles while he was there. So Judas knew where he'd be, because if they're not at the house, he's probably over here. So Judas knew the pattern, the habit. Verse 3, Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. So they're coming prepared, okay? They're basically prepared. So they've got lanterns and torches, which is light, so they can see where they're going and what they're doing, because this is the nighttime. But they came with weapons. They're prepared for someone who's willing to resist arrest. Now, it's not that, it's funny, because even Christ made a comment, I think it was in the Gospel of Matthew. He talks about the idea that he's like, you guys have hung out with me before. You know who I am. Why would you think I would resist the arrest? In everything I've done in my life, what would tell you that I would be violent? And so it's funny that Christ brought that up in, I think it's in the book of Matthew when they go over this time period. But in their mind, they're thinking from their perspective, okay? He might resist arrest. We may have some problems with his apostles. That Peter guy is a pretty hot-headed dude. So we need to be prepared. And so they're thinking with worldly concepts of power. Okay, that's the thing we want to realize, is they're thinking, in order for us to have power over him, we have to have the greater threat of violence, the more force, basically. That's one way the power dynamics work in this world. So they're coming to take him. Verse 4, Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, whom seek ye? So now realize that this is after the atonement has been done, that they come get Christ. John doesn't tell us some of those details in this chapter of what Christ suffered. Verse 5, They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. And as soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. So what's interesting about this is when we look at verses 5 and 6, is again Jesus. He's like, who are you looking for? Oh, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Oh, well, that's me. That's and they're like, holy cow, whoa. They were surprised that it was him. Some people look at this and think, they realize who he was. I don't know. There's probably more to this than what we're getting in here, but it is interesting to think that they fell backwards. They were stunned. They were shocked that it was him. Maybe they were preparing. Maybe they thought it would be more of a fight. Maybe they didn't think about. They were thinking more of this is a big deal. And he's like, why would you think this is a big? I'm not resisting you. Now verse 5. One thing that's interesting is when he says, "I am he." This is not in the older manuscripts. The word "he." Okay, if you notice in your King James version, it's italicized. That's because they didn't quite understand what to do with that word. So it would originally have read meaning I am, meaning he is the Old Testament God. So if you remember, the phrase I am refers to Jehovah. And so when they say, we're seeking Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus says to them, I am. Now that's a statement saying I am who you're looking for. But even just saying I am also implies that idea of God. And so they were a little stunned at this. And in verse 7, then asked he them again, whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. You notice this italicized in verse 8 as well. Wasn't there some of the original manuscripts? If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake of them which thou gavest me, I have lost none. So he's like, let them go. Now verse 9 might not be, sounds weird for Christ to say, hey, let them go because we need to fulfill scriptural prophecy. Verse 9 is probably a scribal commentary that was added in. But Jesus is saying, look, if you're here to get me, that's fine. Just let the rest of my disciples go. So now we get the famous story in verse 10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So this is really interesting because just the fact that they gave the servant's name might mean this was an oral tradition that was given by an eyewitness. So just because he slew Malchus's ear off. So Peter pulls his sword and he's ready to fight. He's that hot-headed person. He's ready to take him on and go to the death. Verse 11, then said Jesus unto Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band and the captain and the officers took Jesus took Jesus and bound him. Now we don't get in here the part of the story that again Jesus picks up the ear, goes over to Malchus and heals him. John doesn't give us that detail, but that did happen. So the atonement has happened. Gethsemane's done. He's now this is the last night of Christ's life, basically. So then they take him and they go. Now, verse 13, they led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest of that same year. So what this means, he is the head of a powerful priestly family. That's what Annas is. In the Sanhedrin, he was appointed high priest by Rome in 6 AD and lasted until 15 AD. Through his sons, he kept an influence going though. The people accused him and his family of collaborating with Rome and turned on them in the Jewish revolt of 66 AD. So that's Annas and his family, basically. They realized that they're siding with Rome, working with Rome, and so they saw him as traitors in 66 AD when Rome came down to attack. Now, here's a quote that I have from Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. It says, after Jesus was arrested, he was taken to Annas first and then to Caiaphas. John is the only gospel writer to mention that Jesus appeared before Annas. Annas had been the high priest in Jerusalem from AD 6 to AD 15 after Roman authorities removed him from office. He continued to exert considerable influence in Jerusalem. 5 of his sons held the office of high priest at different times, and his son-in-law Joseph Caiaphas held the office at the time of the Savior's arrest. Historical sources describe Annas' family in terms of wealth, power, and greed. To better understand the Savior's movements through the streets of Jerusalem, from the upper room to Gethsemane, to Annas, to Caiaphas, to Pilate, and so on. See the Bible maps to see more about that. So, powerful priestly family was controlling a lot of Sanhedrin, had a lot of influence. They took him to Annas first, and then in verse 14 it says, now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And remember, that's a prophecy that Caiaphas gave, that we talked about in Luke, discusses that one. Verse 15, and Simon Peter, so now we've jumped over to Peter's experience here, followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. So this is the house of the high priest, basically. And this other, we normally hear Peter following Christ. Well, John tells us there's another disciple, and we believe that's John. He's put himself in the story. Verse 16, but Peter stood at the door without, and then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. That's Peter's first denial. If you remember that story, now John's